All righty, good evening, everybody. If you would, get your Bibles out, open them up to Acts, the 16th chapter. We'll be right there at the end of Acts chapter 16. Going to finish this chapter tonight and work our way into the 17th chapter. As we're still here in the second missionary journey of Paul and Silas and other various comrades along the way. We've got Timothy and Luke that have been part of that, and we're going to close out the story of the Philippian jailer and Paul's work there in Philippi tonight, and then work our way westward. It is great to see everybody tonight, and as always, if you've got things that you would like to add to our discussion tonight, you feel free to cut me off at any point, or raise your hand, or shoot up a flare signal, whatever you need to do to get my attention, and we'll work together in the Scriptures and come away hopefully better equipped with what the Scriptures are trying to say to us. So we've talked for the last couple of weeks about the gospel coming to Philippi and a number of eventful things that happened there, and we concluded, I think, pretty much the story of the Philippian jailer and his conversion, the conversion of his household last week. I will just pause. Any kind of hanging things anybody wants to say about the jailer or about his conversion that maybe just didn't get a chance to do that previously? Want to do that tonight? Tom. Yeah, right.
They couldn't get out. They didn't know which way to go because it was so dark.
Yeah.
That building we have in her, there's places we don't have a flashlight. You can forget it. You don't know which way to go, how to go. It's black.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. There would have been, being in the inner part of the jail as they were, that would have posed some troubles, especially for, that's maybe another answer to the question that Susan asked last week about, well, why didn't the other prisoners just up and run out of there? Well, it was probably problematic because it was very dark already, especially add to that if the earthquake caused things to start falling down and apart, you've also got all kinds of debris all around, which would have made that even more difficult. So, those are just some good practical observations to think about. Now, we do know that when that event occurred, somewhere during the course of that night, they evidently were able to get out of the jail, at least Paul and Silas and the jailer, because we're told back there in verse 34 that he brought them up into his house and set food before them. Obviously needed to as well go someplace where there would have been a pool of water nearby to be able to baptize him. But having said all of that, we also know that they evidently at some point after that came back and remained in the jail until the morning came, and that's where we pick up right now in verse 35. So let's read together verse 35. But when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore come out now and go in peace." So there's our clue that they had went back into the jail, because the jailer says, "Come out now." Now, we're not entirely sure why the magistrates have had kind of a pretty quick change of heart, because it was just the day before that these magistrates, were pretty hasty to allow people to beat on Paul and Silas and then just toss them right into jail. And now here, maybe not even a full 24 hours later, we're saying, oh, okay, let these guys go. If I'm kind of a betting man, then maybe one of the things that I would say is a big reason why they're willing to let them go is because they maybe came to a conclusion that probably a lot of the prisoners and the other people in the jail that night came to, and that is that earthquake that happened and all the fallout from that, it's associated with these two men. These two guys, this was maybe their God. It has some connection to them in some way, and we don't want any more of the problems and troubles that are coming with messing with these men of Jehovah or whatever their concept of God was. It may also just be that these magistrates just, realized that it was a very hastily made decision, and whoa, we just probably shouldn't have done that, shouldn't have put those guys in jail so quickly. We probably should have, went through the due process procedures and so forth. Whatever it was, though, they're asking, hey, you guys, go. Just go ahead and get on out of here. Well, that's then what sets up this, this gives me a chuckle looking at Paul's response, because Paul's response in verse 37 is this. Paul said to them, "But they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and they've thrown us into prison. Do they now throw us out secretly? No! Let them come themselves and take us out." So Paul is having none of this business of, oh, okay, well, we're going to get beaten and whipped very publicly, and everybody sees that, and it causes all kinds of damage to Paul and Silas's reputation and the work that they're trying to do there in Philippi. But now, when it comes to do the right thing, well, we're going to do that all secretly, and we're not going to say anything about this, and we're going to ask these guys to just kind of slip out of town. Paul says, nope, not having any of that. We are demanding an apology. Now, we maybe would be inclined to read that and think, all right, well, this is just Paul, just kind of wanting to get even a little bit, kind of demanding, doing the right thing for him, and we're demanding an apology, and that it may be that kind of a tone that Paul is taking. I actually am not really persuaded by that. Paul will incur lots and lots of this kind of treatment, and very rarely will we see Paul say, nope, we're not accepting this kind of release. I think what maybe Paul's doing here is, first of all, we'll talk here in just a second about him asserting his Roman citizenship. But secondly, I really think maybe he has intentions and is mindful of the new group of Christians here in Philippi. And that maybe these are actions designed to provide some safety and protection for what will be the church in Philippi. We know we've got at least Lydia and some of the people in her household that are Christians. We've got the jailer and some of his household that are Christians. Maybe even some others along the way that are becoming Christians. We got the genesis here of a congregation in Philippi, and he wants to see to it that these people are not treated unfairly, that they're not treated the way that Paul and Silas were treated. And so maybe Paul's wanting to kind of push this a little bit, not so much for his own benefit, but maybe for the benefit of these brethren. Now, the text doesn't say that. That's a Josh McKibben speculation a little bit, so you take and do with that what you will. But it does seem a little bit out of character for me to just assume that Paul's just, he's just wanting to get even. All right, you beat us publicly, but we demand a public apology. I think there's more going on there than just that. What do you want to say, Cody? And that's very possible. God is a God of justice, and I'm not completely excluding that possibility. What else?
He's just showing some righteous indignation, as far as I'm concerned.
Sure. Let's just say something about Paul finally speaks up here and actually just makes it known. Hey, we're Roman citizens. We're uncondemned. This thing was done to us, and this is not the kind of treatment that Roman citizens are supposed to receive. In fact, there are like big penalties if you did this kind of stuff to someone who was a Roman citizen. There is evidence from historical records that if a person in Paul's shoes pressed charges that this was done unjustly to him and Silas as citizens, there is possible that the people who did this, they could incur things like being stripped of their power, being stripped of their position as magistrate or whatever position they had in the city. There are some cases even where the citizenship entirely of those people could be taken away from them. There was an example of that happened during the reign of Claudius, when some unjust crucifixions were done to Roman citizens in AD 44. And what Claudius then did, when he found out about that, he then stripped those people who did that, who lived in the city of Rhodes, stripped their citizenship away entirely. So it's a serious offense, and he is calling attention to that, and there's righteous indignation here, no doubt about all of that. This does still beg the question that I asked a week or two ago, and that is, well, how did you prove that you were a Roman citizen? Again, people probably didn't carry around official ID cards or driver's licenses that said, official Roman citizen or some kind of a badge or something. There had to have been some other way in which that was proven. And I still don't know how one did that, but I will give you this for thought. There were huge penalties if you asserted Roman citizenship and you come to find out that person actually wasn't a Roman citizen. So people were not just careless and flippant to just start tossing around, oh, well, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't do this to me, if they really weren't. Because one of the penalties that you could incur is you could be executed for that. That's how seriously the Romans took that. Don't be falsifying your citizenship. And so it probably was not very likely that people did that very often, just tossing out, I'm a citizen, if they really weren't. And so if Paul's willing to speak up here and say, I'm a Roman citizen, people, oh, okay. that changes the whole dynamic of everything. That puts us now, as the Philippian magistrates and so forth, that then puts us in the wrong, and we now are potentially going to have some problems of our own and create some issues for us. And so, there's definitely some good reasons as to why Paul would want to make that known and to demand some kind of acknowledgement on their part. What else down through 37, Tom?
Two things. I used to have National Geographic, still have a bunch of them, but I read somewhere years ago that it was required for citizenship, you had to have 4 or more witnesses to verify that. Be family members or whoever. It's not just a Roman, but all these countries back in those days.
Yeah.
Before they had written verifications. But also on these magistrates, I think Paul is putting them in a position to say, they'll think twice before they jump to a conclusion and impeach somebody.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Certainly he's trying to maybe kind of help establish a precedent for this to not happen again. And as I said a moment ago, I think maybe some of this would be, he's thinking about some of his brethren now, some of these Christians there in Philippi who maybe would potentially be looked at and be treated in a prejudicial way because of their association with Paul and Silas. He wants to make sure that they don't get treated that way in the future. Kent?
What was done was already done as far as the beating and throwing them into prison that way. They were about to leave the city either way, whether they did it secretly or out in the open.
Yeah.
And so I do think, he obviously did that for some purpose, and maybe he was thinking of the church at Philippi, but maybe themselves too down for the next city they went to.
Right.
Where word would spread, be careful with these fellows because they're Roman citizens and don't be too harsh with them.
That's right. And even thinking about as well, that got me thinking, well, what about if Paul was able to make a return trip back to Philippi? Would want to be able to come and not have to deal with that same kind of harassment if he ever made a return trip. Yeah, there's lots of very practical reasons for wanting to kind of, speak up here and not just quietly, we're going to, we'll just duck out and do all that secretly. Nathan.
I think Paul's looking out for the future church, and anyone that may be on the fence, they saw him take the demon out of the girl, that probably got a lot of attention, and he's looking out for anyone that, may be on the fence of whether they want to be a Christian or not.
Yeah. Other potential candidates for the gospel, for
Word would spread from city to city.
Right. That's right. There's probably several different considerations for Paul to assert this, which does just bring up. Let's just talk about this. I do think that this example provides for us kind of some authority, if you're looking for it, that it is proper for us to utilize the rights that have been afforded to us, whether in our country or by our Constitution or whether, locally, the civil rights that we have been granted by our government. It is proper for us to use those to ensure safety and health and liberty, primarily for us to be able to continue to serve God and to spread the gospel. That we ought to make use of those benefits. Now, having said that, I do think, and I know of some Christians, and there's even some churches in just kind of the religious world at large that I fear sometimes are kind of too quick to resort to those things, to just immediately go run into the courthouse whenever there's any slight hint of the government infringing upon those rights. I think we saw some evidence of that this past year during COVID. I think some folks were maybe a little bit too trigger happy about that. And I'm not even saying necessarily that they were wrong in asserting some of those rights and wanting to go to the court about those things. But I do find it interesting that in the case of Paul kind of waits till the very end here before he pulls out that card. In fact, later on in the book of Acts, whenever Paul gets incarcerated and he's going to be in prison for the better part of 2, probably even a little bit longer number of years, it's not until after several years that Paul finally says, I appeal to Caesar. Again, it's kind of a last resort sort of thing. It's not always just first measure, hey, let's go to the courthouse and battle this out. But it is proper, and I think this is an example that shows us that it is proper to assert those rights when they are needed in order for us to be able to have liberty and safety, to be able to worship God and serve Him as we can. Because we want to be able to serve the Lord personally, and we want to be able to share the gospel with others and help them to serve the Lord. What else might you want to say about that particular subject? Anything? Go ahead.
There's things that we can do that are rights that aren't wrong, but we need to first look and see if that looks becoming for a Christian to do it.
I tend to think maybe that was kind of part of what Paul was thinking here. Like instead of the first moment that the people laid their hands on him there in Philippi, instead of just immediately shouting, I'm a Roman citizen, I'm a Roman citizen, leave me alone. Instead, Paul kind of waits it out. And in doing so, he does exactly what you says there. He ends up demonstrating something about the character of Christians by virtue of kind of waiting as long as he possibly could before asserting those things, those legal recourses that would have been available to him. Agreement with that, or any other inner discussion about that? Cody.
I think from Paul's perspective also, he had the opportunity to teach, and I mean, he may or may not kind of had the foresight from the Holy Spirit to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Think of the Philippian jailer.
Yeah.
Had he appealed to Caesar very first thing, there's a chance that would have happened.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, so there's all, and of course, we can say all that in hindsight because we know that, but it is very possible, that the Spirit was directing in some way, and, maybe Paul had knowledge from the Lord not to exert those things. I'm not 100% sure about that, but definitely we see here that there was benefits to him kind of holding off on pressing those legal rights because other people ended up becoming knowledgeable of the truth.
We know that from what he says later, he was able to be content in whatever situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's an opportunity to we develop our own character by enduring a little bit of hardship. I think if all of us kind of reflect upon, the past year during the COVID drama, I'd like to think that we're now, we're kind of coming out of all of that. I'd like to think all of us are maybe a little bit more, a little tougher, a little stronger in different aspects of our character as Christians, and that just required us to kind of bear up a little bit and maybe endure a little bit of discomfort and a little bit of hardship when we could have done what some other groups did, where we're going to take Governor Beshear, we're going to take him to court because they're suggesting us not to meet inside of a church building. Yeah, we could have done that, and we maybe could have been right back inside the church building on March the 29th or whatever that very next Sunday was. But we didn't. And yet we were still able to worship God. We were still able to try to serve in the very best ways possible. And on the other side of that, like I said, I like to think that we've come out of that maybe a little bit more rugged and tough. What else here?
I think Paul was just practicing swift ears, slow speaking, slow rap.
Yeah. Just some restraint and some self-control, but it is here at the point now where he does want to now, like I said, kind of assert some of that. So, what's the response? He says, "Let them come and take us out." We're demanding kind of an apology here. So, verse 38, the police reported those words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. There's your indication that it was going to be a big problem to find out if Paul indeed pressed charges that these kinds of things had been done to Roman citizens. Verse 39, so they came and apologized to them, and they took them out, and they asked them to leave the city. And so, verse 40, they went out of the prison, and they visited Lydia, and when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. I kind of chuckle a little bit when I read there in verse 40 that, it's kind of like, okay, we'll leave, but we're going to take our time. We got some people we want to visit. We want to go over here and see our sister Lydia. We need to talk to some of the brethren here. We'll be on our way in due time. But we've got some strengthening that needs to happen before we exit entirely. And notice there in verse 40 that it says that when they had seen the brothers, and that term there is brothers and sisters, that they encouraged them. That is, that Paul and Silas encouraged Lydia and whoever else was there in that place. Which is really just remarkable to think about, because we'd like to think, here's Paul and Silas, they came out of this terrible ordeal, and you'd like to think, well, they're the ones who need some encouragement. Man, when you build these guys up because of all the tough stuff they've just been through, and yet encouragement it's a two-way street. What Paul and Silas do by their example and the things that they then share with Lydia and those folks, it ends up providing them encouragement and helps make them, just kind of more eager and maybe excited about the work that was going to begin there in Philippi. Final thoughts on Paul's work in Philippi.
Would you like to know what they thought about the jailer, the magistrate, him becoming a Christian? They thought, oh.
Yeah, definitely. You know, this is, when you just think about, this is one of the things that just makes the gospel and it makes the church so unique. That it brings together people from such disparate backgrounds. You know, here's Lydia, this woman who was a seller of purple. We kind of speculated that she may have been a very well-to-do woman. It's very likely that she herself was a Gentile, was a Greek. So here's this businesswoman, and we got her and whoever else is in her entourage that becomes Christians. Then now on the other hand, we've got this jailer who is presumably as well a Gentile man, a man who is an employee of the Roman government. Now he is a Christian. You know, it's very, very different people. Then whoever else might have then come into that equation over time, the bringing together of all of these people. And that's not to say that just makes being the church easy. In fact, in a lot of ways, sometimes that makes it complicated because you have so many different personalities and people with such differing backgrounds. Now we're having to learn to be united and function as a body. Of course, that is the impetus for a lot of the epistles that Paul sends, because you have churches that are not functioning properly as a body. But that's all because you just got different people from different walks of life coming together. And just seeing the origins of the Philippi church here really kind of helps to put some of that into perspective. But the gospel has the power to bring people together in that way. What else on chapter 16 in Philippi?
It says that they visited Lydia, kind of like to think that they still wanted just a little TLC from her.
Sure.
She was so compelling when they went the first time to come and be with her in her home.
Yep. You know, and when we talked about Lydia a couple of weeks ago, I've mentioned, I've known people like her that, you know, they're not going to take no for an answer when they're trying to be hospitable and trying to show some kindness. And when you get around people like that, it provides a great sense of comfort. And I have no doubt about it, even though the text says that Paul and Silas was encouraging them, you have to know that encouragement worked back in the other direction as well. And they were, you know, comforted by her and the good example and the good things that she was doing. What else here? I will have you just note, and maybe just circle it there at the end of verse 40, we've had a shift in pronouns once again, that it's now a they. Luke's been talking in terms of we and us, but now it shifts to they and them, which means, presumably, Luke stays in Philippi. And there's even maybe good reason to believe that Luke did do that, and why he did that, because there was actually a very notable medical school in Philippi at that time. And of course, Luke being the good doctor, maybe he had some association with that. Maybe he's getting some continuing education credits or something. Don't entirely know all of that, but the assumption is that Luke maybe kind of stays here, and maybe he's kind of part of he's part of the group that's going to kind of remain behind and help this new church. You know, I know that we've seen several times where Paul and Silas, they'll travel away from a congregation, and what a lot of times they'll immediately do is on the return trip back, hey, we're going to check back on those folks. Well, we may not get to come back to Philippi anytime soon. So how about we leave Luke here for a little while? Luke's going to maybe be able to help them out for a little bit and get their legs under them, and they can begin to function as the church ought to. So we got Paul and Silas now. And it seems like maybe Timothy's still with them. So chapter 17, verse number 1. The journey continues. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. If you were looking on a map, and Randy, you can actually change the screen there to put the map up. We're looking up here, kind of in the top left corner of the map. The distance from Philippi all the way over to Thessalonica, there's not any real detail given about the work in Amphipolis or Apollonia. So to get over to Thessalonica is about 100 miles. So it's a pretty good haul to get over there. And in Thessalonica is actually situated between a couple of mountain ranges. You have to go through a couple of big, heavy terrains to be able to get to the city, and the city actually sits at the base of a very famous mountain. It sits at the base of Mount Olympus. And Thessalonica is a large metropolis, and one of the reasons for that is because it was a free city. What that meant is that meant that city was not occupied and governed directly by the Romans. It had free city status. That meant that that city was allowed to kind of do the internal affairs of the government, establish their own laws, and kind of govern their people accordingly, provided that they don't cause disruptions, that there's not riots and outbreaks, provided that there's not any kind of evidence of civil uprising, that there's going to be some kind of uprising that would form against the Roman government. And in fact, this issue of Thessalonica being a free city and wanting to kind of maintain that free city status, it actually plays a little bit, I think, into the narrative here in these first 9 verses of chapter 17, because we're going to see that the Thessalonians, we don't want those kinds of problems to break out because we don't want to lose our free city status. And so, it's an important town. It sat along the Egnatian Way. Mentioned that a couple times. It seems like that's kind of where we're traveling. It was a main trade route. And if you'll notice, if you can see on the map where, well, it's really just hard to even see on the screen there. But up there in the top left corner there, it does sit not only along the Egnatian Way by land, but it also is close by sea. Which means there's just lots of traffic, whether by sea or by land. Lots of people coming in and out of there. Paul wants to work in that area. And, unlike Philippi, we notice verse 1 that there is a synagogue here. So there is a Jewish presence here in Thessalonica. And what's Paul going to do? Well, Paul's going to do what Paul always does. Chapter 17, verse 2. So Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days, for 3 weeks, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And so Paul gets the opportunity here for 3 consecutive weeks to do some teaching here in Thessalonica. And notice the terms that Luke uses to describe what he's doing there. He doesn't just use generic terms like, he's preaching or teaching. Notice in verse 3, he is explaining and proving. The word explain literally means to open up the mind. He is trying to help open up the minds of his hearers. And he's doing that by the second term, by proving. That word literally means to lay alongside. And what that means is that means that the things that Paul is saying, he is then laying those things, his teaching, he's laying that alongside the Scriptures. Notice in verse 2, he's doing this teaching from the Scriptures. So here I'm saying some things, and I'm going to lay that alongside the Scriptures, and what my hope is that you're going to see agreement between those two things. Now, there's several things I think we can take from this. Number one, this just emphasizes to us the importance that teaching needs to be heavily devoted to the Scriptures. I've said before, I think there's a place for us to, attest to the working of God in our own lives, and maybe to share about, how God's blessed us, and how maybe tell our story of how we were converted. I think there's something to that. But that's not the primary means, the primary tool that we need to use when we're teaching. The primary tool that we want to use is the Scriptures. And Paul is using that here because he's got a Jewish audience. He's got people who know something about the Scriptures, so he's going to prove from the Scriptures. And what's he trying to prove? He's trying to prove that it was necessary that the Christ would suffer and that He would rise from the dead. Preaching about Jesus suffering and then being killed, and then rising from the dead, that was oftentimes a very tough sell for Jews to hear. That was just hard for them. Because what were Jews looking for? Jews were looking for a big, triumphant Messiah. They were looking for somebody who, had the handsome good looks of David and was a great military power. Someone who would be able, with strength and with might, just kind of look the part, who would be able to form the uprising that the Jews needed to fight against the Roman government, and we can then establish Israel once again as the superpower that it's always meant to be, and we can show that we are God's people in all the earth. That's what the Jews are looking for. And so for Paul to come along, in fact, all the apostles to come along, and to preach things about how the Messiah actually, He's going to be mistreated. He's going to be beaten. And He's going to be crucified. And they're actually going to kill Him. It's just hard for Jews to accept. But that's what Paul's trying to do here. He's trying to prove that from the Scriptures that that's exactly what would happen to the Messiah. That He is indeed Jesus. That's who, the guy that you've heard about, he was the one. And he was rejected, but now you have the opportunity to accept him. And so, do some of these people accept? Well, apparently some of these people do accept. Verse 4, some of them were persuaded, and they joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. So hey, notice that we've got kind of a mixed bag here, kind of a mixed audience, as is oftentimes the case when Paul frequents these synagogues. We got a strong contingent of Jews who are listening to him. We've also got some of these God-fearers, people who would show up at the synagogue. They wouldn't be granted full entry into the synagogue. They'd be allowed to stand along the walls and listen and participate to some degree. And then you even got, there's specific mention here of some people of high standing and some rank. In addition, we've got some women here who have some measure of kind of some rank as well. I don't know if this means these are just kind of upper class women. Maybe they were rich women, or maybe these are the wives of high-ranking officials in Thessalonica. Maybe one of the things that I just would point out about that is that in the New Testament, oftentimes, probably more frequently than we even realize, important people who are of intelligence, people who have rank and standing, oftentimes have even greater interest in the gospel than the people who were the quote-unquote religious people. Oftentimes it's these folks who gravitated the most to the teaching of Jesus, even more so than the Jews who'd been taught this all their life and had grew up going to the synagogue and going through all the parts of worship that involved. I don't know, it just says something to me about how different things are in our society today. In our society today, people who are Christians are often looked at as being, stupid. And, you must be just real pathetic in your life, and you must not have much of a standing in this world and more important things to do. Yet in the Bible, it's the exact opposite of that. People who do have some importance and some standing, they saw value in the Scriptures and in the teaching of Jesus. Thoughts on those first four verses? Tom?
On their first journey, was there a church established here?
They've never been this far west, so no.
So when they've been there 3 weeks, correct? What you're saying?
Yep.
How many are they? We know 2 anyway.
Right.
They would have to assemble as Christians first day of the week to have a service. I talked to a person recently, and they brought this up. I said, well, God's word says if there's 2 more gathered in my name, I'll be there. So you can have a service. They didn't agree with that. They go, no, you gotta have a church, you gotta have this and that. But so we can assemble just 2 of us and have service and have our service and be praising God and bring a service to Him.
Yes, and I, and if somebody, pressed me to, all right, well, explain, what Paul and Silas, or we think Timothy's also here with him. And in fact, I want to say there's a verse down here that does indicate Timothy is still with them. Yeah, when we get to verse 14, we'll notice Timothy's still in their company. So we got at least 3 guys. What they did specifically when they would come into these new towns and while they were on their travels, what they did when it came time for the Lord's Day, if somebody pressed me to, all right, well, explain to me what they did. Well, I don't have like a specific answer for that because I don't know. What I do know, just knowing the character of Paul, Silas, these other guys, is they did what was pleasing to God. I have no doubt about that. And whether that meant if it was just them 3, worshiping together and being mindful of the Lord Jesus by partaking of the supper on the Lord's Day, or whether that also means maybe trying to make arrangements whenever Sunday rolled around so that they could meet with the church. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if a congregation of God's people would have been able to be established by that first Sunday that they were there. Sabbath day's on a Saturday. So if you had some respondents to the gospel on that Saturday, that first Saturday, well, you might have had some Christians that, hey, well, all right, we'll start a church. And so come that very first Sunday, all right, well, we're ready to start functioning and operating as a body of the Lord's people. However that worked, we just don't have all the details to. I think we can just be confident that they did what was right and they did what was pleasing to God. Yeah, Nathan.
Verse 4 says some of them were persuaded and joined with Paul and Silas. So that could be some of the first Christians right there.
Yeah.
They're persuaded to mean something. Well, they left what they was doing.
Yep.
Start following Him.
That's right. And I'll just be honest with you, I think that just means they became Christians. I don't think it just means that they were persuaded enough to just kind of tag along with these. I think this is just one of those synonyms that Luke has used often to describe people who've become believers themselves. What else here, verses 1 through 4, before we get to the trouble? Well, there is trouble, as is seemingly often the case. Paul seems to be a lightning rod for some of that. So, verse 5, but the Jews were jealous. And taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob and they set the city in an uproar. And they attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. Now, this is, we've noted this several times already, it is the unbelieving Jews who consistently are the troublemakers, the problem starters wherever Paul goes. It's not the big bad Roman government. It is consistently, again and again, it's unbelieving Jews who are causing those problems. And on this occasion, we see just how wicked intentioned some of the Jews were in their unbelief, so much so that the text says in verse 5, they were willing to align themselves with noted wicked people in an attempt to run Christianity out of town. They are attempting to make everybody prejudiced against Paul and against Silas so that problems will occur, so that they can't get a foothold here. And they're trying to paint out that Paul and Silas, they're the troublemakers. They're the ones causing problems here in this city, when in fact they were the troublemakers. We take note there in verse 5 that there's mention here of this man Jason, that evidently Paul and Silas maybe were, but we don't know anything else about this Jason except what's mentioned here in chapter 17. I'm assuming maybe this is a brother in Christ who maybe welcomed Paul and Silas in. Maybe he became converted during their time there, and then just kind of used his own home as a place for them to board and to stay. The way that Luke just kind of mentions Jason almost makes me think that Theophilus, who was the original recipient of the book of Acts, that maybe just Luke just assumes that Theophilus knows who this is. Jason. You know Jason. Of course I know Jason. So whoever this Jason is, he's serving an important role here, and that is he's providing a place of stay for Paul and Silas maybe. It may also be that his house is also being used as kind of the meeting place. And that's often the case in the New Testament, where the church would meet in people's homes, and that was not an uncommon thing at all. But hey, we're banging on the door of Jason's house. We're demanding you bring those men out to us. You send them out here because these guys have caused problems here in our city. Verse 6, that's kind of specified even more as to what those charges are against Paul and Silas. Verse 6, when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." Now, this statement in verses 6 and 7, there's an aspect of this that is truthful, but it is also a grave misrepresentation of Paul and Silas and the teaching that they were doing. This accusation that they make against Paul and Silas, you need to know, it has some real revolutionary overtones to it. We look at that word, the ESV, and I think the King James uses the word turned the world upside down. Adam, you've got the New American Standard, right? It uses a different word. What word does it use? Verse 6. All right, they've upset. That word, the exact same Greek word, is found later in Acts chapter 21 and in verse 38, and in there it is rendered revolt. And that's what they're saying here. They're saying these guys are fermenting a revolt, a revolution against the order of things, the things that the Roman government has set in place. These guys are revolutionaries. Now, if you're like me, and I've done this in my preaching before, I can remember a sermon I preached here about 7 years ago. And I quoted from Acts 17 verse 6, where it says, these guys have turned the world upside down. And I got up and I preached vigorously, that's what we need to do. We need to turn the world upside down by using the gospel and just kind of turn things on their head, and man, it'll just be great. Well, hopefully everybody understood what I meant by that. But the fact of the matter is, that's not what these guys mean when they say that. They mean Paul and Silas are revolutionaries. They are political revolutionaries. And so I hope you'll forgive me from 7 years ago when I preached that, because that's not what I was saying. I'm not suggesting that we need to be political revolutionaries. I think there is a sense in which Christians can turn the world upside down, but not in the sense that they mean it here. They don't mean this as a compliment. They mean this as a charge, like this is a crime that they are doing. And in the Roman world, there really was no greater crime. I mean, if you want to get the Roman government's attention, the quickest way to do that is to do something that's going to cause people to think that a revolution is taking place. And that's exactly what's happening here. When you get a mob together, as the unbelieving Jews have done, you get all kinds of people creating, shouting and screaming, and maybe we don't even know what's being shouted. If Mr. Emperor or anybody else back in Rome catches wind of that, all they're going to think is, we got a problem down there. And we got to get down there and shut that down. And so they're kind of leveraging that a little bit. The other thing that they say there in verse 7 is that Paul and Silas, etc., they are acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another King Jesus. Now, once again, that's kind of partially true. There is another king, and he is Jesus. Jesus is a king, but he's not a king in the same sense that Caesar was. Jesus isn't a physical king. He's not reigning over a physical kingdom. Jesus reigns over a spiritual kingdom. And while these people who are making these accusations, they're trying to advance the idea that Paul and Silas and these guys, they're saying that you can ignore, you can do things contrary to Caesar's law. Well, that wasn't true. But there's a sense in which maybe it could be true. And that is whenever man's law conflicts with Christ's law, we ought to then obey God rather than man. And so maybe then in that sense, then the statement would be true. But Paul and Silas are not going around teaching people, hey, don't listen to Caesar. You can ignore the rules of the land. In fact, Paul repeatedly in his writings, Romans 13, Paul talks about being subject to the governing authorities. Other places he talks about honoring the king, honoring the emperor, praying for those in leadership. And so that's a very different very different picture that's being painted by these folks making this accusation. David, you're back there. I thought you did this and a little bit of this, so I guess that means you want to say something.
I was just going to say that it seems like it's exactly the same thing the Jews did to Jesus.
Yes.
I mean, they had false witnesses.
Yep.
It's exactly the same thing. They haven't changed.
That's right. That's right. This is very much mirroring the scene when Jesus was arrested and the kinds of charges that were made against him. That he's professing to be a king when we've already got a king, and he's telling us to do stuff that conflicts with what the king, the Caesar, is saying. And so, yes, this is very much kind of this is 2.0 of that very same scene. Let's look at the last verse or two there in this little section here. Verse 8 then, so the people in the city authorities, they were disturbed when they heard these things. And I think the disturbance that the authorities had is because of the nature of these charges and the fact that they see visibly a mob taking place. It's got them concerned about what's going to happen if people in Rome catch wind of this. We got to shut this down. So verse 9, when they had taken money as a security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. And so we don't want Rome to learn about these things, so we're going to kind of intervene in what's going on here to try to shut this down as quickly as possible. And so it says there in verse 9 that they take this security from Jason. Maybe your translation says something about a bond or some other kind of word. It just means some money was being put up that promises that there's not going to be any further trouble. In fact, Paul and Silas being asked to leave the city, that might have been even kind of one of the conditions of this bond or this security, is that these guys, they have to leave town. All right, we'll not press any further charges, and we won't take any further action. But you guys got to get out of here and let us go back to normal. And Paul and Silas, we're going to see that they do comply. We can talk about a little bit about that next week when we look at Paul and Silas heading toward Berea and then heading toward Athens. Appreciate everybody's attention tonight.